Hey everyone, and welcome to the Rene Descartes Philosophy of Science lecture. And before I get into Descartes, I just need to say a few things about the two perspectives that we're going to study in this section, on the broad section being Philosophy of Science. And I need to explain why science has a philosophy. Why are those two things connected? So I would begin by pointing out that what you learn in school about the scientific method, which includes peer reviewing other people's work to make sure it's good, repeatable experiments, and just general experimentation, logical reasoning when you write up your experiments and so forth, when you write up the scientific data and report. The scientific method, of course, is supposed to weed out bias, and it's supposed to just kind of focus on the ideas and the evidence. And that's why science is often associated with evidence. What's the evidence? What's the justification? So there's a deep connection between science and philosophy there. But in science, that we have to remember that science didn't just fall to us from the clouds, right? We didn't just discover and say, oh, hey, here's science. It had to be honed and refined over the years based on new people coming in and saying, okay, this is the best way to find the evidence. This is the best way to do science. This is what has to happen. In what we refer to historically as the scientific revolution period, around 1700, depending on which historian you ask, in the broader area that we call Europe, that scientific method was being developed at that time. So people during that time, during the scientific revolution, were starting what we know today as the scientific method. And they were stabbing in the dark. They were trying different things. And a lot of them were doing experimentation, were, doing basic, what we would consider basic science today, what you might do in a high school chemistry class. And others were doing a different kind of science. And so what you had was different perspectives on how to find the answers, how to figure out how things work. There was an agreement among all those people that, hey, we're trying to figure out how the world works, right? And that's really what science is about. Let's figure out how this world works. Something that Aristotle started for us, you may remember, who wanted to figure out how can we categorize and sort of understand the natural world. And these guys and some girls in the scientific revolution were doing a similar thing, but they were trying to get more concrete. They were looking for more specific methods. Aristotle didn't really give us much of a specific method to figure out the world. He had some, but not much. So my point here is that there were many different views that conflicted. We're going to focus on two of them. And one is called rationalism. And it doesn't just mean being rational. Sometimes people sort of misinterpret it that way. What it means is using rationality to solve problems. So for instance, I often think of Einstein when he used to lock himself in his room for half an hour or so and just think through ideas. He would just be logically, rationally thinking through, does that work? No, let me think about this other thing. Does that work? That's rationalism. Rationalism is sort of thinking about stuff without experimenting, without testing it. Sometimes it's referred to as armchair philosophy, in the sense that you could sit in an armchair, as Einstein did, and just think about things and discover truths. So in other words, one path to figuring out how the world works is just using rational arguments and deducing logically what is the case. We know today that that's part of the story in science. You have to be rational to be a scientist in some regard. But we also know that that's not the only part of the story. So the other school of thought that was kind of floating around during the scientific revolution was called Empiricism. And I'm sure some of you have heard that term before. It means to be empirical. It means to care about the evidence. It means that you don't just want to think about something as a rationalist would. You want to test for it. You want to go out and say, does it work? How can we figure this out? It's the difference between somebody talking about a policy and how great it is and somebody else saying, well, no, let's see if it actually works. The empiricism part is the does it work? Can we actually see in the real world that there's evidence of this thing? Now, to be fair, this is a class where we're focusing on archetypes, general influential models of people. There, of course, were many other people than the ones that I'm citing here. So we're going to study one famous rationalist, Descartes, and one famous empiricist, Hume. There were many others at the time, and there were even many views in between. So I'm not trying to deny that there was a historical mishmash and it was a lot more complicated. But I do think that these two folks represented extremely influential views that have continued to be part of science. As you can recognize today, science is both rationalism and empiricism, right? It includes both and more. We've added more to the scientific method, including bias reduction techniques and peer review and so forth. But we're going to look at two influential views, philosophies that eventually led to become the scientific method. Once again, rationalism and empiricism. So the other thing that was happening during this time, historically, during the scientific method, was that it wasn't just the rationalists and empiricists who were coming in and proposing new models of truth and reality and how we, and asking questions about how do we figure things out. There was also a general cultural shift from the medieval worldview in Europe. So when we studied Avicenna and Aquinas and the Islamic and Christian philosophers, we saw that they clearly put God first. God was everything. They were reasonable. They were rational. Avicenna's and Aquinas' first cause argument, or cosmological argument, for instance, is very rational. There must have been a first cause, like it goes through the premises. But their confirmation bias was there because they believed in either the Christian God or the Muslim God, and they weren't going to waver from that position. And so this starts to shift as we move into the scientific revolution. You start hearing people saying things like, well, no, I can care about science and understanding of the world and still believe in God. Or they say things like, well, I believe in some more impersonal type of force or God, kind of taking us back to the Tao or the Logos from the ancient Greeks. So you see a shift start to occur. And like most historical shifts, it's something that's gradual, and there's a lot of different working parts leading to the shift. But there is a shift nonetheless. And the way it's often characterized is that the individual becomes more important than the collective. The individual reasoner, our own independent ability to reason, becomes prime and important next to, say, God or the church or thinking about the afterlife, right? And that's the major shift. Now, of course, if you're a religious person, you might see this in a negative way. You might say, well, that led to more individualism and more selfishness. And there might be some truth to that, but it also led people to stop the tyranny of some of the churches. I mean, whatever you think about a religion, we have to admit that churches are run by people. And during the medieval times, there were some terrible things happening. There were preachers who were sometimes taking people's fingers and sleeping with people's wives in the name of God. And it led to a lot of unrest. So the individuality I'm talking about actually wasn't just, atheists versus people who believed. It was actually within religion. And the famous example of Martin Luther, who I'm sure you learned about, the guy who nailed the criticisms of the Catholic Church to the door, that's a perfect example of that, because Luther was still a Christian. He still strongly believed in Jesus and in God and the Bible. His argument was, I don't have to listen to these preachers tell me how I should think about the Bible. I shouldn't have to listen to this priest tell me what I should think about the Bible. Luther argued that all human beings are endowed with reason and that they can interpret the Bible themselves. Now, it's important to understand how big a shift this is, because throughout much of history, religion has been interpreted by those in power for the common people. There's been a clear divide. And the common people have often been fed and believed that they are secondary or inferior, and that these priests or preachers are somehow closer to God. And Luther's trying to change all that. He's like, not only are these priests not closer to God, but sometimes they engage in immoral behaviors, like I mentioned. So anyways, you have this shift that's not just science-based, it's also within religion. And by the way, that led to a shift in Christianity that we still feel today, where there are Lutherans now because of the rift that Luther created in the church. He started his own church. The Protestant movement was in part a result of Luther and others like him. So there's this shift to individualism. And there's, of course, the obvious examples of people starting to actually be empiricists, like Galileo and Copernicus, and shifting our focus to how the heavens work, like what's happening in our solar system. And naturally, the argument was, well, we're revolving around this thing called the sun, not vice versa. And as you probably know, he faced heresy charges for that. Copernicus and Galileo both faced consequences for their continual pressing that, hey, it's not the way we thought it was. The Earth isn't the center of everything. So anyways, all of these changes are in the background as we're discussing this material. And Descartes, the one we're going to look at now, is one of these people. So the ideas we're going to look at are going to come down to mainly epistemology, and that's no accident. Remember, epistemology is the theory of knowledge, and they're developing the scientific method. So it's all about knowledge. How do we know? How do we figure out the workings of the world, the mechanics of the world? So I already mentioned rationalism. We're going to look at one theory of truth called the coherence theory, or truth is coherence, that was created during this time. Now that may seem strange to you to think about a theory of truth, because you may believe that, well, something's true or it's false. But we need to figure out under what conditions can we call something true or false. That's what these guys were doing. And that's why we need theories of truth. And scientists today have their own theories of truth. And then finally, we'll look at a famous argument called the cogito argument. You probably know it more commonly as the I think, therefore I am argument. Cogito just means I think in Latin. It's sometimes called cogito ergo sum, Latin for I think, therefore I am. Now, strangely, Descartes never actually said that specifically, but he makes the point, and we'll talk about what he meant later. And then we sort of passed over a particular argument for God when we talked about Avicenna and Aquinas, and that argument is called the Ontological Argument. It's basically the idea that if I can conceive of a perfect being, something perfect in my head, then how else could I get that idea if God didn't exist, right? If there wasn't a perfect being, doesn't the mere fact that I can think of a perfect being, doesn't that suggest that he exists? So we'll look at that argument and some objections to it later. And then finally, we'll deal with the problem that scientists are still dealing with today, although the problem is now referred to as the problem of consciousness. Why are we conscious? Why is it that if we built a fully functional robot that looked and talked like you, we would call you conscious, but probably wouldn't call the robot conscious? Right? Why is it that organic life, or like ourselves and even plants and animals, why is it that there seems to be some level of understanding or awareness with their experience? Science still cannot explain this. Back in the day, the problem was called mind-body, because what we didn't understand was how does the mind influence the body? And if the mind is some sort of soul, how does that have an effect on something physical? Today, many scientists believe the mind is physical, but they still can't explain our experience of consciousness. So anyways, we'll touch on that idea, and I'll show you how that old idea of the mind-body problem has become a new problem based on our current understanding of reality and the brain. So Descartes himself, although he's generally classed as a philosopher, it's important to understand, and I think I mentioned this in a previous lecture, that back then we didn't have divisions between disciplines. Right? You couldn't go to school and decide, I'll study sociology or philosophy. Right? If you went to school, you would have just studied what we consider philosophy. You would have always also studied science. You would have also studied psychology, but they wouldn't have called it that. As I've said before, it wasn't until the 18 or 1900s that we started specializing the disciplines and saying, you want to study the brain? Guess what? Now you're a psychologist. You want to study how the mind works? You're a psychologist. You want to study how liquids work together and different properties of them? Now you're a chemist, and so forth. The reason I say that is that it's hard to classify Descartes, like many of his time, because he had his hands in so many different things. So, for instance, he was also a mathematician. He's also often lauded by mathematicians as one of the great mathematicians of history. And I'll tell you his contribution in a minute, but I do want to mention before the next slide that he also interacted with some famous people of the time. So he actually tutored Queen Christina, the Queen of Sweden, and he actually had a pretty strong intellectual relationship with her. As we'll see later, there was another princess who he communicated with who actually gave a logical critique that is still used today regarding the mind-body problem of Descartes' view. So anyways, he was, even during his time, he was well known and respected. Now, what he did for math, the main contribution is what we call today Cartesian Coordinates. You know, basically, supposedly, the way he came up with it was he was lying on his bed. He spent a lot of time just thinking, just sitting. This is what rationalists do. They sit and they think about stuff. So one morning, supposedly, he woke up and he's lying in his bed thinking, and he sees the ceiling. And he sees it in a vision. He sees the coordinate system laid out in a vision, and he quickly gets a pen and paper and writes it down. And now we have Cartesian coordinates. Obviously, we've gone further with that to understand how to plot a point on three-dimensional space and so forth, but Descartes got the ball rolling on those coordinates. So, rationalism. So rationalism, like I said, the idea that, and just to have a clear definition, rationalism is the belief that reason is the primary source of all knowledge. So a rationalist might believe that there's some small point in, testing things. Like they might say, well, you should kind of understand how the world works a little bit. But mostly they would argue that when we figure out new truths and new ideas, it all has to be filtered through our own reasoning process. So most rationalists, especially of the time, would have said that. They'd say, look, experimentation's all good and well, but the main way we find information and find new truths is through what we would call today the process of deduction. Sometimes a Latin word is used, a priori, or before experience. So rationalists are people who believe that you don't have to appeal to reality around you. You can only look inward to find those truths. Some examples are truths by definition. So for instance, if you tell me that your friend John is a bachelor, I don't have to go meet John and say, excuse me, are you unmarried? Right? Excuse me, are you an unmarried man? Or if you tell me that all bachelors are unmarried men, I don't have to go through the world and test for that and say, hey, are you a bachelor? Are you an unmarried man? Good. Okay, one, you're a bachelor, unmarried man, two. No, because I know by definition that a bachelor is an unmarried man. Right? So I don't need to go out and test for it. Now that's a simple example, but that's what rationalists believe about everything. Almost everything can be reasoned through a sophisticated process without really having to go out and test for anything. So, in other words, if we create the right definitions, if we understand reality in that way, we can find new truths based on what we already know. Another example is the common syllogism, or argument in logic. All men are mortal, Socrates is a man, so Socrates is mortal. We don't have to go talk to Socrates or whatever person we're talking about in the argument. We know that if it's true that all men are mortal and that person is a man, then he must be mortal also. We don't have to go ask him. So what I'm pointing you to is deductive logic, which takes known information and derives truths from that. And that's what rationalism is all about. So the theory that many rationalists believed about truth, and again, seems like a silly question, but it's actually an extremely important one. And that's, what is truth? How do we define something as true? Because people are going around in society all the time saying this is true, this is false, that's not true, this has evidence, this doesn't. Seems like knowing the circumstances or conditions under which we call something true would be quite valuable to our national debate and interpersonal ones. So this view of truth is called the coherence theory, or truth is coherence, and it's just like it sounds. It's kind of the idea that if something conflicts with what we already know to be true, then it must be true, then it must not be true. If it conflicts with what we already know, it can't be true. But if it fits with what we already know, if it doesn't contradict what we already know, then it is true, right? So in other words, think of it this way. The coherence theory basically says that as a culture, as a society, we have a ball, think of it like metaphorically, like a ball of truths, like a rubber band ball. And you have this ball of truths that we have just been continually adding rubber bands to over the years. And when the truth fits, we add the rubber band and it sticks. When it doesn't, the rubber band bounces away. So for instance, we know that the earth is round, right? We could say there's plenty of evidence that the earth is round. So therefore, that's part of the ball, the earth being round. That's part of our cultural knowledge that we all accept. And then when somebody comes in and says the earth is flat, that instantly bounces off, right? That rubber band bounces away. Again, I'm using this metaphor. So that's the idea, is that whatever is coherent with what we believe, another way to say it is whatever is consistent with what we believe, it's true. If it's not consistent, it's false. Now this makes sense, of course, on some level. That we would, so for instance, if somebody comes up with a new theory and it contradicts Einstein's laws of relativity that he famously came up with years ago, I mean, that's a good reason to be very skeptical of that theory, right? Maybe that theory is gonna revamp everything we know about science, maybe. But at the same time, a rationalist or a believer in this truth is coherence would say, well, it's not coherent with what we know, we gotta reject it. But that example also shows you exactly the problem with the coherence theory of truth, which is what happens when what you know is bullshit. Right? What happens when you've supposedly discovered a truth that is actually not true? And there's a number of examples of this in science, not the least of which is that most intelligent people in the Middle Ages used to believe the Earth was the center of everything, and they were wrong. And so that's exactly why it was a problem when people like Copernicus and Galileo came in and said, well, I don't think it is the center of everything, because they already believed that was a fact, that it was the center of the universe. So therefore, anything that came in, they threw it out. They said, this conflicts with what we know. But they were wrong. And so this is the weakness, the limitation of the coherence theory of truth, is that you may have accepted, even as a culture and society, right? Everybody may have accepted a false belief or something that's not true. That's what the appeal to popularity fallacy taught us. Just because everyone believes it, even scientists, doesn't always make it true. So the truth is coherence theory suffers from that for that reason, that somebody could, you could have the ball of rubber bands and not all those rubber bands are true even though you've added them to the pile. So there's that weakness. Now, what Descartes does next is going to continue this process of deductive knowledge, deductive reasoning, and working through our mental knowledge to figure out a deeper truth. We're going to see this process put absolutely to the test. And Descartes called it methodic doubt. So supposedly he did what I was explaining before. He went into his room, shut the door, told no one to bother him, and said, you know what? I'm going to use my rationalist method to think through what is the ultimate certainty in all of the world. What can we say is the number one absolute certainty? What is absolutely certain? And so this process, it's important to understand, is called methodic doubt. And even more important, is that Descartes said, I don't know what I'm going to find. I'm going to doubt everything I know. And he said, I'm going to do it really. I'm going to try not to let my biases get in the way. I'm just going to doubt everything I know. And after that, if what's left, that's going to be the one certainty. Right? It's like, if you try to prove something wrong over and over and over and over and over again, and the same thing just keeps coming back to you, you might say, okay, then this thing is true because I couldn't prove it wrong, no matter how hard I tried. And so that's what Descartes does. He goes through methodic doubt and he says, is this the one certainty? No, that doesn't quite make it. I'm going to reject it. Is this the one? No. And he comes up with one absolute certainty that we'll see. And this is the I think therefore I am argument. So I think a good idea, and what I do with my students in my face-to-face class, is for you to try that yourself. Do a Freewrite, and I'll throw one up here on the board here to give you some ideas, but I strongly recommend that you briefly do a Freewrite where you consider, just like Descartes did, go through everything you know and start asking yourself, is there a reason to doubt any of these things? And be honest. That's a crucial part of Descartes' argument, be honest. So people often point out the difference between what Descartes' doing and what the medieval philosophers were doing. Because the medieval philosophers already believed in God, and they were basically seeking reasons to support a belief they already had. Right? That's different than Descartes, who was like, I don't know what I'm going to find, but I'm going to go through a process and the result will be whatever it is. Right? Descartes was not expecting any particular result. Now, Descartes' bias comes in later. We'll talk about that. I'm not saying he wasn't biased, but in this particular argument, he's really making an effort to be open-minded. So the argument is actually in the reader, and the section after the section that says methodic doubt and the cogito. Remember, the cogito is, I think, in Latin, cogito ergo sum, I think therefore I am, and that's the argument we're now discussing. And the argument, you can see, has a number of premises, and the first one is anything that can be doubted is not certain. So I want to be clear that you're learning two things here. You're learning about Descartes' view of knowledge and how to find the ultimate certainty, but you're also learning about deductive reasoning and rationalism, because this is a rationalist argument. Again, Descartes goes into his room. He doesn't have to go outside and run an experiment as a scientist would. He doesn't have to go into a lab or have a clipboard or anything or wear a white lab coat. He's just a normal person in his room doubting stuff. And it can be phrased and structured, as it is here in the Reader, as a deductive argument, leading to the one ultimate certainty, which you can see there is existence. But let's figure out how he gets there. So the second premise, he first of all, he says, look, if I can doubt it, it ain't certain. And he's going to do everything he can to throw arrows of doubt at each one of these concepts. And he says, let's start with what most people would start with. What am I certain of? Everything I'm experiencing in front of me. So I'm certain that I'm holding this coffee cup, one could say, because I can see it and I can feel it. I'm certain that I'm staring into a camera because I can see it right in front of me. I'm certain that I'm speaking because I can feel and hear my voice internally and externally, one could say. Descartes says, nope, none of that is certain. Because we know that our senses can doubt us in some ways, therefore it's not clear that they don't doubt us in other ways. So what Descartes is saying here, he's not saying our senses aren't reliable. He's saying, look, our senses, probably there's a camera, probably your eyes are not lying to you, but sometimes your eyes do lie to you. And we know our eyes lie to us because of optical illusions and things like dreams. And I'll throw up this optical illusion now, which is, you probably don't want to stare at it for too long, but the lines are actually parallel. However, just based on the way the other shapes are placed, it tricks our brain into seeing them as curved or not parallel. And we can keep measuring the distances to convince ourselves that they're parallel, but every time we look, our brains just shift. And so Descartes didn't have access to the optical illusions we have today, but that's the point he's making, is that our minds trick us, they mess with us. What Descartes did have access to is dreams. And he actually, as you can see in the Reader, he literally discusses dreams in this argument. Because in addition to the argument I presented, if you did the reading, you'll notice that I also included some of Descartes' original argument for this proposition. So you can see Descartes' writings, and then you can see the more modern analysis and interpretation of what he was saying. But anyways, he talks about dreams. And he says that, sometimes when you're dreaming, in fact, we might say most of the time you're dreaming, you feel like you think you're awake, right? You think it's real. That's one of the reasons why you get sad when you wake up and you had a really pleasant dream. You're just kind of like, oh, it was just a dream. Or you're happy when you have a nightmare and you wake up because you say, thank God, it was just a dream. But what those reactions indicate, and we've all had them, is that in your dreams you believe them to be real. Right? So right there, our senses are deceiving us on some level in dreams. Right? They're sort of, dreams in a way are an elaborate deception. And in fact, we know this because we have a phrase for the rare occasions when people actually become aware of themselves in their own dreams, and those are called lucid dreams. And I've only had a few in my life, but they're really cool. It's kind of like your dream becomes a video game. You get to just play and explore the dream world that you're in. You kind of say, hey, I'm dreaming. But the fact that those are rare, suggests that most of the time our senses and our dreams are deceiving us, making us think it's real. But of course, we've also had experiences in reality, I'm sure you have too, of things like mirages, or even cases where you may have been half asleep, or maybe you're sitting on the couch watching some Netflix late, and you're kind of in and out of consciousness, you're kind of falling asleep. And something might happen, like maybe a roommate coming in to grab something from the fridge, and you're actually legitimately not sure if you dreamed it or if it really happened. Because it does happen that sometimes we pass out for a little bit on the couch when we're tired, and we have a short dream of something, and then we wake up, right? So it's not, in other words, that's another example of how our senses can deceive us. And of course, the cognitive biases we talked about before are perfect examples of the way our senses deceive us. So Again, Descartes' not saying our senses aren't reliable. He's just saying, hey, I'm looking for certainty, guys, and our senses aren't certain. If they doubt us in these moments, we can't use them as a foundation. Right? So it's important to see that Descartes is looking for 100% certainty, not reliability, and that's a big, crucial difference. Now, this next one gets crazy, and this is where a lot of people have said, man, was Descartes on drugs or what? And I think there's some merit to that objection, but I also think that, as I'll argue, it's not as strange as it seems at first when we consider other things that people believe. So here's what Descartes says, because what's the next thing that you would argue? What's the next thing that a normal, rational person would argue after our senses? If Descartes says, hey, our senses aren't certain, we can doubt them. And you might say, okay, fine, Descartes, I get it, our senses aren't certain, but math is always certain. Right? You might refer to scientific mathematical equations, deep truths, one could say, about the state of existence, about the universe. You might even take a simple point and say, look, man, 2 + 2 always equals 4. I don't care how much you deceive me with my senses. I'm always going to know these mathematical truths. 2 + 2 always equals 4, one could say. Now, here's how Descartes combats that. Because remember, he's looking for absolute certainty. So he says, you know what? It's possible, if there's the possibility that there is some sort of evil genius type being, basically like an evil god, as you can see in the image, like somebody messing with us as though we're puppets with the strings, or sort of imagine like, the evil kid who torches the ants with magnifying glass or something, just for fun. Imagine that guy has all power and is God. That's more or less is what Descartes' talking about. So God, for instance, as we saw, is often defined, especially in the Western world, God is often defined as a being, a separate being from us, who is all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-loving. Descartes here, with the evil genius, is an envisioning a being who's all-powerful and all-knowing, but not all-loving, right? But evil. So imagine the scariness of that idea. Imagine the being like God who has all that power and knowledge, but doesn't care about us and in fact might want to harm us. And Descartes says, again, Descartes' not saying that it's likely that something like that exists, but he says, hey, we believe in a God that is all-powerful, knowing, and loving, and there's no direct evidence of him. If there's the possibility of a God, I mean, we already acknowledge the possibility in Christianity of like a devil or something, an anti-God, an antichrist. Why couldn't there be an evil genius that exists who's like God, who's part of this universe too? And if such a genius existed, and this is where the math comes in, he could do whatever the hell he wants because he has all powerful and he has knowledge. So he could twist my brain. He's all powerful, right? Like the kid with the magnifying glass. He's got all the resources. He could tweak my brain into believing false things even about math. He could make me, so for all we know, if there's an evil genius, what if 2 + 2 really equals 5? But we all believe it's 4 because the evil genius has messed with our brain. I know it sounds ridiculous, but you have to understand, what would a being with all power be able to do? They'd be able to do anything. They'd be able to make you believe anything. Right? That's the idea. So again, Descartes' not saying this being is likely to exist, but he says if he did exist, then he could deceive me even about math. So therefore, even if math is likely to be certain, there's that small possibility of doubt. So Descartes says it's gone. It's out the window. We can't use even math as a foundation for certainty. Now that takes a lot of things off the table, right? Because, and now let me just move to another point here. Sometimes people will say that death is the one certainty. But notice that Descartes' argument about our senses would actually exclude death from being certain. Right? For one thing, we only think death is certain based on what we've observed with our eyes, because we've observed other people dying. None of us has ever experienced death, or we wouldn't be here. We've seen other people die, and we've heard about, and we understand history. But first of all, who's to say that we're not going to construct some sort of, find some sort of cure for mortality? And if you think that's crazy, I suggest that you take a look at the immortal jellyfish that apparently can rewire its whole genetic code to go back to what it was like when it was first born, and it can just keep doing that. so it has the potentiality to be immortal. If we could take that natural process and figure out how to apply it to humans, who's to say that we couldn't be immortal someday? But the point is mainly that we haven't experienced death, and everything we know about death comes through our senses. But guess what Descartes said about our senses? They can't be a foundation for certainty. So death, logically, I'm using deductive reasoning right now, by the way, death cannot logically be part of the certainty in Descartes' argument, right? It's also in doubt. So if all these things that seem so certain, from our senses to math, are in doubt, what the hell do we have left? I mean, doesn't that seems to be pretty depressing? Well, Descartes wasn't after making you feel good. He was after figuring out the truth. So he rejects those ideas, and as you can see in those last few premises, he ultimately comes to the conclusion that existence is the one certainty. And this is where we get to, I think, therefore I am. So no matter how much, and you can see Descartes specifically says this in the reading from his writings, from his meditations, no matter how much the evil genius deceives me, no matter how much my senses deceive me, there's one thing that still remains, and that is that I'm something. How do I know that I'm something? Because I have these internal thoughts. So that's where I think therefore I am comes from. I think there are thoughts. I have the presence of thoughts in my mind. Therefore, that proves that I exist as something. Now, very crucial to see. Descartes is not saying that he knows you exist as you are. He's not saying he knows you exist as your particular personality and name and time and place. He's saying you exist as something, right? For all you know, your existence could be the figment of some, in the evil genius's mind. For all we know, our existence could be in some computer simulation like the Matrix. And that's really the implication of Descartes' argument here, that our existence is certain, but not the nature of our existence. We don't know what we are, but we know that we are, right? We know that there is something. Why do we know that? Because there are thoughts at all. If there were no thoughts, we wouldn't be anything. All right, so the one thing we know with certainty for Descartes is that we exist. That's all. You can't get further than that. Now, there are some clever people who try to mount a clever defense against Descartes, but Descartes has a clever answer. And this is the argument against Descartes. It's that, well, Descartes, you just said we could doubt everything. Can we not apply your own standard of doubt to your conclusion of thinking? Couldn't we also doubt that we're thinking? And Descartes' response to that is, yeah, but you're just proving my point, because doubt is a type of thought. So if you say, I doubt, you're proving that you exist, ironically, right, in contradiction to what you're trying to say. If you say, I doubt I exist, that's still thinking. Right? Descartes isn't saying that the content of thought is certain. He's saying the mere fact of thought, the presence of thoughts, is certain. And in fact, as he notes in the reading, it's actually thinking in the present moment. He's not even saying that the fact that you thought in the past is certain, or that you will think in the future. He's saying when you sit down and say, I'm thinking, I think, I doubt, in that moment, right now, you know that you exist. That's what he's saying. Now, the reason I have that picture of the phrase, I think therefore I am, inside the guy's head is because you have to try to understand this argument from a subjective personal level. Every person has to look within themselves to see what Descartes did. And that's why I asked you to go through that process that Descartes did, of sitting down and just kind of free writing on what you could be certain of. Because you have to understand that this is an argument every individual makes for themselves about the world around them. So I don't know if any of you ever had sort of paranoid thoughts as a kid. Many philosophers like myself do, where you sort of felt like, what if my parents and my friends are just all robots? What if they're all just androids or something? And of course, this reminds us of shows like movies like The Truman Show, where they weren't robots, but Truman's life was clearly a fiction. Have you ever thought that you're the center of some sort of a conspiracy that way? Right? That's kind of what Descartes is getting at here, is that you don't really know what's going on in other people's heads. You don't know that they exist because they come through your senses, which are unreliable. But you do know about your own thoughts and your own existence. And again, every person from their own internal place has to come to that conclusion to see Descartes' truth here, that existence is the one certainty. Now, to be fair, there have been critiques, legitimate critiques of Descartes' argument, and one of them is that some people have said, well, actually, it's not just thinking, but it's feeling. Right? Feeling is also an ultimate certainty because there's a certain internal quality to feeling as well. You know, I can feel it in my heart and my body when I'm sad or mad and so forth. And in fact, in Descartes' reasoning, you can see that even he wavers. He actually uses the word feel a couple times, although he mainly focuses on thinking. But in any case, I hope you can see why this has been such an enduring argument, because it has such a personal appeal that we can all individually go through that process, finding our existence being the main source of certainty. So the problem, of course, now is if we accept Descartes' reasoning, what the hell is the point of anything? Because nothing is certain except my existence. Am I going to go around thinking I'm in the Matrix and pretending that I'm part of some grand conspiracy? Well, Descartes said no. And this is where people have accused Descartes of copping out. Because basically what he does is he says, well, despite everything I just said, and by the way, if you're interested, I would suggest picking up Descartes' Meditations, and it's after what I presented in the reader that he goes on to make this argument. And Descartes basically says, look, it's true that if we were relying only on ourselves, we would only know that our existence is certain. But he says, and if that were true, there may be an evil genius that is deceiving us. But he says, also, if there were a good God, he would never allow us to be deceived, and that would erase the possibility of doubt and an evil genius. In other words, for Descartes, God saves everything, because if there's a God, then he can guarantee for us that he would guarantee that we have an objective shared reality, because he created all of us together. If there's a God, and if he's good, he wouldn't want us to doubt. He wouldn't create doubt in our minds. So, in that way. So if there's a good God would erase the problems that Descartes has just outlined. Now, Descartes was a Roman Catholic himself. And so, like I said before, this may be where some of his bias comes in. Because, again, a lot of people take his argument here to be, oh, well, God saves everything. And even weaker, some people suggest, is that the argument he uses to say God does exist was actually one that had been used many years back already. So he was rehashing an old argument for God. And that's the ontological argument. So let's take a look at that for a minute. So this argument basically says that God, it takes a different approach to defining God, although in the same range as we consider an all-powerful, knowing, and loving being. But this definition of God, as you can see there on the PowerPoint, is that God is that than which nothing greater can be conceived. As I like to put it, pardon the profanity, the greatest fucking conceivable being. The greatest goddamn conceivable being, pun intended. Right? It's the being that nothing greater can come of it. It's the best, total, absolute measure of perfection. That's what God is. So when we have a definition of God like that, we have to ask ourselves, where did that idea come from? Why is it that we can even conceive of such a God? Well, the way Descartes puts it in the ontological argument is that we can conceive of that because there wouldn't be that thought in our mind if that God didn't exist. Right? Where would we get the idea of perfection? And also, if we have the idea of perfection, we say, oh, it's just an idea, but it doesn't exist in reality, wouldn't that take away a piece of the pie? Wouldn't that suggest that God is not perfect? So therefore, the suggestion is, we have an idea of God, it must mean that he exists, because a perfect being couldn't be missing a piece. We couldn't say, oh, he's perfect, but he doesn't exist. It's like, well, wait a minute, if he's perfect, he must exist. Right? So an assumption in this argument is that perfection requires existence. The idea of perfection means that necessarily includes existence. If something's perfect, it must exist by definition, right? So in other words, if we can conceive of the greatest conceivable being, then it must exist. It wouldn't have been put there if he didn't exist, and we couldn't have the idea if it wasn't perfect, right? So the essence is that if you can conceive of him, it means he exists, because perfection requires the existence of something. Right? It cannot have a missing piece. Now, the counter-argument to this was actually given by a dude many, many years ago, before Descartes, I believe his name was Guanilo, not important, but his counterargument was called the perfect island objection. And it basically says, well, and I bet some of you thought of this already, it says, okay, well, I can conceive of a perfect island. Does that mean a perfect island exists? Right? I can conceive of a lot of things that might be perfect. Does that mean it exists? So, in other words, the argument fails for a lot of people because there doesn't seem to be a link between perfection, the idea of something being perfect, and the existence of that thing. There's also the problem that this argument treats existence as a property of something, like an additional thing. But actually existence is what gives rise to even having properties. Either something exists or it doesn't. So for instance, I wouldn't say that, I have a Quest bar here, one of these protein bars. I wouldn't say that, this protein bar is roughly rectangular and it's kind of bluish white. Oh, and it exists also. Right? I wouldn't list existence as a property if I was describing something to you. Right? If you called me on the phone and you said, hey, can you describe that thing to me? I need to explain it to someone else. I wouldn't add existence. I wouldn't say, oh yeah, it's blue and rectangular. Oh yeah, and it exists. Right? And you wouldn't be like, oh yeah, good. I'm glad you said it exists. Right? It's assumed that it exists. So the argument also fails because it treats existence as some kind of a property, like it's red, it's white, and it exists. Like if we're describing the properties, it's already assumed that it exists in the first place. So the argument fails for assuming that existence requires perfection, some would say, and then it fails because of that last reason, that existence is treated as a property of something when it's actually the thing that gives rise to even having properties in the first place. If it exists, it has properties. If it doesn't, it has no properties. Right? If something doesn't exist, it's not red or white or anything like that. It can't be part of that description. Now I know that gets a little confusing and complex, and it actually gets even more confusing because there are still people debating about this argument today. I actually personally believe that this argument is one of the better arguments for God in some of the more modern, updated versions, and I'm not going to get into depth on those in this class, but if you're interested, I suggest checking out all the entries in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy on the ontological argument, where you see some of the more modern versions of it. To me, it's a fascinating argument, and I think it's very much worth discussing, even if there are some weaknesses. In any case, Descartes' purpose here is he says, well, I established that God exists with this argument, and God erases all the doubt. Right? So the answer to our existence is the only certainty is God erases that, makes it so that everybody else exists too, and he fixes everything. Right? That's the idea. Now, whatever you think about Descartes' response there, he goes on to discuss this other idea, another idea that was very prominent during this time, and you can see thinkers from all different persuasions writing about this problem, called the mind-body problem. And as you can see there in that chart, it's, to put it simply, it's how does the mind affect the body? How? Like literally how? How does it work? We may have platitudes where we say things like, oh, having a good mind means you have means that you're physically healthy if you're mentally healthy. But we're actually interested in the mechanics here. Right? These are scientists, early scientists, trying to figure out, how does it work? When you have a thought, how does it happen that if I say, I think I'm going to raise my hand, what is literally the physiological process that occurs that leads to my hand raising? Right? They didn't know the answers to these questions back then. But even more deeply is, if I have a soul, and this is really the problem, if I have a soul, something non-physical, and I challenge you to really think this through if you believe in a soul that's non-physical. If I have a soul, how could something non-physical like that have an effect on something physical? The way we think about, say, billiard balls when you're playing pool, it's very clear that when I hit the cue ball, and it hits the 8-ball or whatever, that there's a physical thing occurring to cause the next thing to happen. What if there's no physical thing in my brain? If my soul is somehow disembodied and connected to some higher soul, how do I have physical actions? How does that work? Now, the problem was actually, remember I mentioned earlier that Descartes communicated with a lot of famous people at the time, and Princess Elizabeth of Bohemia basically sends him some letters. She hears about his work, reads his work, and sends him some letters and says, Descartes, it doesn't make any sense. No, by definition, she said, logically speaking, she said, I'm not saying something non-physical doesn't exist necessarily, but just logically speaking, you can't have something non-physical affect something physical. It doesn't work, right? So she completely denied the link. Now, scientists today would answer the question by saying, well, it's all physical, right? It's all on some level. They would argue that we don't understand, they would admit, we don't understand everything that's happening in the brain, but they would say it's all one. So if I could unite that diagram of mind and body to show you what many current scientists today believe, it would be one thing, and the mind and body would be connected as one. So in other words, how is it that when I have a thought to raise my arm, how do I actually raise my arm? And the scientist would say, well, your neurons fired, you had a thought, that was literally detectable in your brain, which led to you to raising your hand. They would be able to explain perfectly how my mind and body connect. However, scientists don't have the last word here, because even if there are legitimate objections against the mind-body problem, there's still the question of consciousness. And that is a question that scientists certainly cannot explain. And, I've heard some neuroscientists, people who study the brain, say that we've understood as a species about 6 or 7% of how the brain works. I'm not talking about that platitude that we use 10% of our brains, which, by the way, is a myth. I'm sorry to break it to you, at least not consciously. I'm saying that literally in terms of our understanding of how the brain functions, I've heard some neuroscientists skeptically say that we understand like 6 or 7%. So the new question is, what is consciousness? Because think about it. If you're a naturalist, if you're a scientist who believes the natural world is the source of everything, and you believe in evidence, and you believe in reason, and you don't think there's a soul, how do you explain the fact that I seem to have a soul, right? It feels like I'm a person. It feels like I'm something. You can look into my eyes and feel something deeper. Maybe that was a little too personal, but I'm just saying you can do that with other people. You can get a sense that there's something more than just their physical body. But scientists are telling us, oh, it's all your physical body, right? So where does that extra source of meaning come from that seems to be there? And it's not just people. If you have a dog or cat or animal, you know that there's a sense in which you might say there's a soul to them. There's something there. So this is where scientists really come up short, because they like to criticize a religious person who will come in and say, well, we have a soul, and they'll say, haha, that's silly, there's no evidence for a soul. But then when they try to explain consciousness, they don't have any answer either, right? So this is one of the great problems of our time that scientists are working on. And there's actually a great journal that I highly recommend called the Journal of Consciousness Studies, where questions and new research is presented every month, every couple months. But to get you to understand the deeper point about this argument about consciousness, and to get you to see why that's a problem, I'm going to refer you to a famous philosopher named Thomas Nagel, who argued in a famous article that you can find for free online if you're interested, and I highly recommend it. It's called, What Is It Like to Be a Bat? What is it like to be a bat? And what he really, the point he really makes is that bats seem to be complicated creatures. They even seem to have, faces with a lot of meaning. They see the world in a different way. They detect things with sonar. But clearly, it's like something to be a bat, right? Like, even if I can't become a bat, I know that there's some property, some way that it's like to be a bat. I can imagine what seeing with sonar might be like. I can't experience it, but I can imagine that it's like something to be the bat, right? The bat has some level of consciousness. So consciousness, then, is what it's like to feel. It's the feeling of existence. Now notice, it's crucial, that I don't know what it's like to be a camera, because I can't even imagine that there's anything that it's like to be a camera, because a camera doesn't seem to have that animating force of life. So what is it like to be something organic, to be something that is a being, that is a thing? What is it like? The problem is with consciousness is we only know what it's like to be us, right? We don't even know what it's like to be other humans, as we just learned with Descartes. We know that we exist, right? We know very little. And so we know everything. When we think about what it's like to be something else, we have to make it an analogy. Now, this people have disagreed with Nagel. I'm not saying this is the last word, but almost everyone sees this as a great starting point into the question of consciousness. What does it mean to be conscious? Well, it means there's something that it's like to be it. Right? There's something that it's like to be a bad. Now, this, of course, gets us into, even in my opinion, extremely interesting territory that we're going to broach in the next 100 years or so, assuming we don't blow ourselves up, and that's AI. And that's especially when we start developing AI that is sophisticated. Now, I don't know if you guys watch Silicon Valley, but there's a funny episode where they create an AI and the creator kind of falls in love with the AI. And at the end, it's revealed that it is just a thing and that he had fallen in love with a machine. But what if we develop AI to a sophisticated level where we may actually want to call it conscious, right? And other questions arise here, like, is consciousness only an organic thing? Can consciousness only arise in animals and humans and so forth? Or could consciousness arise in a robot if we designed it in the right way, right? Is there a way that we could build consciousness? And also very interesting, in my opinion, is what about plants? Plants clearly seem to have some level, they're obviously alive, but they don't have a central nervous system. They don't have a brain in the way we have one. So the question is, are they conscious on some level? Like, what's it like to be a plant? It seems like it would be like something, right, versus a rock. So anyways, I'm just presenting to you this modern issue that there has been lots of debate over, and there continues to be debate over, and an old philosophical problem, the mind-body problem, has become a new one, which is the problem of consciousness. By the way, if you're looking for something to study, I couldn't recommend more going into neuroscience and learning about the brain. This is really a frontier of human knowledge that is already taking off and will just continue to be a source of interest to people for many, many years. So, in my opinion. So, I want to give you one example of how some scientists have tried to solve this problem. And there's some great YouTube videos with this guy. You can see that theory. It's called IIT, or Integrated Information Theory. This guy, Giulio Tononi, an Italian thinker, argues for that position. Now, this is a view that's sometimes described as panpsychism, and it's the view that the universe is actually conscious as a whole. Right? So this is an interesting area where science is moving back towards religion. That sounds like a religious view. The universe is conscious. But there are legitimate scientists with evidence and reasoning suggesting that it's true, and they really believe it. They're like, this is the theory that I think makes sense. So panpsychism basically would say that the universe is conscious, and this version of panpsychism called integrated information, it says the universe is conscious and it only comes together with the right integrating of information from, the right organization of a brain, for instance, leads to consciousness. And the idea is that different beings in the universe have different levels of consciousness based on the amount of information that's integrated. So in other words, the consciousness of a rat would be dimmer and less integrated than the consciousness of a monkey. And the consciousness of a human would be more integrated than that of a monkey, and so forth. And a plant, and so forth. Now there are some, and don't quote me if it's this guy or someone else, there are some who actually believe that the whole universe has the properties of consciousness, but those properties get used or instantiated in particular instances. So in other words, even this quest bar has the property of consciousness, it just hasn't come together in the right way to become conscious. But if we took the molecules and the matter in this bar and we put it together in the right way, we could make it conscious. Right? So it's another kind of crazy idea. Now, nobody knows if any of this is true, but there's evidence on either side based on neurological studies and brain data and MRIs and so forth. But to me, it's very fascinating to see what happens. And I will also mention one last thing before I end this lecture, and that's so I recommended that you go into neuroscience before, but there's also an entirely new field of study that has arisen. And I was talking earlier about how we didn't used to have these divisions of disciplines, right? You used to just basically be a philosopher if you studied any kind of knowledge. And I pointed out that in the 18 and 1900s, we started seeing more divisions. There are still divisions happening today, and this is a new one. In this case, because the problem of consciousness and how our minds work is so intractable and so interesting to so many people, there's this new field called cognitive science, brain science. And it's a little bit more broad than neuroscience. Neuroscience is more scientifically focused, where you'll be running research and studies, but cognitive science, you could come at it from a number of different angles, which is what appeals to many people. And as you can see, it brings together the approaches of different disciplines, including philosophy, and psychology and AI and so forth. So this is another field that I highly recommend going into if you're not sure what to do. You can definitely get doctorates and degrees now in cognitive science, whereas you couldn't before. When I did my dissertation, one of the members on my committee, one of the people who helped read my dissertation and make it better, was a cognitive scientist. He was in that department. So anyways, that wraps up Rationalism and Descartes, and next time we will look at Hume and Empiricism and continue discussing the philosophy of science.